So welcome everyone to this session of Transforming Assessment webinar series, and tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Andrew Fluck from the Faculty of Education at the University of Tasmania, and I've actually heard Andrew speak a couple of times, so I'm really looking forward to this. Very interesting topic that we're going to hear about tonight, and it's all about e-exams, transforming the curriculum. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, and Andrew will tell us all about how we can transform our curricula through the use of e-exams. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Geoff, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much, Mathew. Slide, here we go, that's me, so just in case the video didn't work. And what I want to do is talk about transformation. Now, this is a particularly interesting time because here in Australia, about 3 weeks ago, our National Curriculum Authority actually released a paper which said we're going to have a new subject on the curriculum called Digital Technologies. And that's in contrast to the use of ICT supporting the rest of the curriculum, so it's now been given the chance to come out, if you like. We look at this slide here and we see examples of the way in which ICT or computers have transformed the rest of society. We've got the ATM taking the place of many bank transactions. We've got the fly-by-wire airplanes coming through, and I've got a reasonably new car that's actually a drive-by-wire car. So we sometimes don't realise that the computers are coming into our lives to such a great degree. And of course, the idea of a book is being transformed by e-readers. So it's interesting that education lags so far behind. Dave Mawson in the USA told me once it's amazing that the kind of Macintosh computer that sits on his desk 5 years before was of the same power as the computer that was used to forecast the weather. But, he says, you don't see many schools doing exciting things like forecasting the weather. Here are some examples of some things which are being done. The first molecule there is actually a Viagra molecule, and I've been playing with a bit of software called Odyssey, which allows you to design your own molecules. And it's very easy to use. There's no reason at all why kids in classrooms couldn't do something like that. Because of the lack of engineers, we're seeing in the USA, we're seeing the rise of STEM subjects, and here's a bridge being built in simulation by students who are going to perhaps become engineers later on. And another example of transformation I'd like to just diverge to briefly before I get into the main topic. A little project of mine a couple of years ago was called Calculus in Primary, or Calculus in Elementary if you're in the USA. And what we did is introduce students to a bit of software called Maple. Maple is extraordinarily powerful. And I show the multiple integral on the left-hand side at the bottom of this slide to audiences, and most of my friends in teacher education cower before this kind of integral. And I say, well, look, by the seventh lesson, these 10, 11-year-olds were quite familiar with that kind of equation, and they were quite able to put that equation into the Maple software and solve real-world problems using integral calculus. We even got them to take the first-year engineering exam in their 12th lesson, and they came out with credits and very, very good results. So we've had some interesting discussions about whether they really understood calculus, and of course from a professional point of view they knew how to use tools of the profession to solve real-world problems using that particular technique. So those are the sorts of things I would like to see engendered by the use of computers in education, but it seems very often that it's actually inhibited because we're not allowed to use computers in assessment. And my wife and I were very lucky last year to take long service leave, and here's a couple of photographs that we took when we were in the north of Nigeria. It does look a bit like a pack mentality, but what's interesting from this particular photograph is that they have arranged to have computer assessment taken very seriously in their institution, both for their first year subjects Most of the assessment is multiple choice questions, and some of them are quite tough, but it's a very simplistic sort of assessment. But they have the capacity in that particular place, in the University of Minna, to run 500 students simultaneously doing some kind of e-assessment. And because competition for universities is so intense, they actually use that same facility to bring in many thousands of young people who desire to enter university. So this idea of using e-assessment, even using it for computer-marked multiple choice questions, is something which is growing around the world. So what I'd like to do is just pause for a second or two to ask if people who are listening are aware of particular systems which are already in use, which allow a student to take their own laptop into an examination in the higher education. If you could put your hands up if you would like to just put forward a couple of ideas that you've heard of, that would be excellent.
So participants, you can either put text in the chat room if you wish, or you can put your hand up and we'll let you have the mic.
Tim's put the Safe Exam browser, the Respondus Lockdown browser. These are interesting examples, yes. Exam 4, I'm glad you brought that one up, Kurt. I've been working with Nora Mogay in the University of Edinburgh, and they use Exam 4 there. I believe the subtitle for Exam 4 is the Armoured Word Processor, which in my mind restricts what you can do with it. I would like to be able to see more than just word processing being done. Not to say we're doing much more than that ourselves, but I'd like to be able to go beyond that. Thank you both for those examples. So there are examples where universities are using some of these technologies. Let's just see why I'm a bit strong on these other opinions. And yeah, you can, thank you Megan, there are examples of places where you can go to do an assessment, particularly in the IT area, and you can go to a registered assessment centre and they will use a secure line to ensure that there's no possibility of collusions. So that's another alternative. So just moving on, it seems to me that we need to keep an eye on the fact that computers are universal machines, and this stunning graphic, which I'm very grateful for, shows in some ways how a computer can act as another computer, and that's a very powerful thing that it can do. And what we would like to do is to unleash the full power of a computer in an assessment setting, rather than just being restricted to word processing. So I have two main points to make, and that is, if we're going to use computers in e-assessment, we should provide a full operating system to every candidate. So I do understand how we have some examples where a browser is used or a bit of software is installed which restricts what you can do, but it's restricted to perhaps word processing. I'd like to be able to make sure that we can give a full operating system to every candidate. And of course, we'll be looking at this topic later as well. To be equitable, it should be the same full operating system for every candidate. So that's one thing that we would want to do. The other thing is that when we're wanting to use video media, for example, if we're using a networking solution, it can be very difficult with modern wireless networking systems to actually provide that video at different times at the full data rate to, for instance, an exam room of 300 students. If you look at the specifications for wireless networks and for wireless network adapters, it's pushing the limit if you want to deliver rich media to a large number of people simultaneously. So that does put some constraints on what you might want to do with an e-exam system. Tim, your point is a very good one. is it an operating system with which students are familiar? And that is actually a stumbling block in Norway, because their exams board has decreed that they must be able to use Microsoft Windows for their exams. That does raise a lot of issues in terms of how do you make sure that every student has the same copy of Microsoft Windows and the same application suite, and what's the license fee arrangement going to be with Microsoft? So you picked up a good point, and I do sympathise with it. Also, if I look at some other questions that we might want to bring up, who is going to provide the computers? Now, we did start off in our particular university using institutional equipment, and that actually puts severe limits on. It was desktop computers, and it was limited to laboratories, and that limited us to a very small opportunity to do this sort of work. We would like our students to bring their own, and we have gone through phases where we now are able to do that. In terms of security, we would like to be able to ensure that exams are done by only the identified individual that's sat at a particular desk. And I've already mentioned the licensing problem that we do have if we use commercial operating system software. So this is one of our current solutions. We provide a USB stick, and you're probably aware that USB sticks can be very small nowadays, and it has at least 3 areas on it. So in our system area, it's a modified version of Ubuntu, and I'll talk about the modifications in just a minute. We have another partition where the question paper and other materials, for instance the rich multimedia, are placed, and we have an answers area which is left blank for students to put their responses into. And so the candidate's client software is free and open source software. It's built on Ubuntu, and we can't really release it any other way, and we want to see people adopting this innovation. Now, I mentioned security, so let's go immediately to the way in which we have secured this. In our first editions, what we did is take out the IP drivers so that there was no way that students could communicate, and we now interdict all the communication, so there's no way that they can use wired or wireless or Bluetooth or any of the other protocols to perhaps collude together or cheat. We also take a pretty strong view about local disk drives, so we make sure that there's no access to the hard drive built into the laptop computer or any device plugged in through a USB port. And the third one is quite a nice one, in that what we ask for every lecturer who wants to run an e-exam is that they provide us with a photograph. Yes, it's trite perhaps, but they provide their cat or something like that. Sorry, Ruth, interdicted means it's prevented by the technology, so we don't allow any communications. So yes, what we do is we put an image, a unique image, which students are very unlikely to have obtained any other way, on the desktop background, and non-technical supervisors can then match the postcard that they've been given in their startup kit with the image they see on the candidate machines. If all those images are the same, then they're okay to go. Okay, Tim, we'll come to the internet in a little while. That's correct, Nick. Yes, we're looking at exams in the conventional sense of the word, in that they are supervised by somebody who is considered to be responsible. And yes, the problem of identifying somebody at the end of a wire is incredibly difficult. We have, however, had people who've been living in Holland as opposed to here in Tasmania, and the normal arrangement is, as for a written exam, they make arrangements to go to the local library, and we take the chief librarian's signature as being the way in which we have got a trusted supervisor. We do that for our ordinary paper exams, and the same process is used for our e-exams as well. Okay, so that's made that clear. what I'd like to do now is look at the process of putting an e-exam together. And the first step, of course, is taking the questions and putting them onto a master USB stick. I did a presentation for people in Estonia a couple of weeks ago, and they quite rightly asked the question, how do you create an e-exam? If you're going to take the potential of this fully operating environment, how do you do that? And that's true, we need to start preparing ourselves to create new kinds of tests, and Geoff Crisp has done this to take advantage of this new environment. So once you've got the master USB prepared with your question paper, if you like, we then put that into a USB duplicator, which makes lots and lots of copies of the master USB. And then, of course, on the day of the exam, those USBs are placed on the desk, and the student comes in with his or her own laptop, and all they find on the desk will be a standard sheet of instructions for candidates undertaking an e-exam and the USB stick. They sit their exam, and at the end of the exam, ideally, actually in the venue itself, or sometimes it's close back home and do this a bit later, all the student USBs are put back into the USB copier, and the answer scripts are stopped off and put into a folder which we then burn onto a CD-ROM. And for the lecturer who's marking, he or she will pick up their CD-ROM with all the answer scripts on it, and it's up to them to then mark in whichever way they like. Now, I've got my team teaching information technology and education trained up to mark on screen. That's our choice. I do know, quite rightly I say, that the law lecturer hands that CD like a hot potato to his admin assistant and has them all printed out. However, even he says that this is very advantageous because he can read all the scripts, and he finds that sometimes very, very difficult. David's come in with power supply. We, at this stage, David, do undertake to give a main socket, a filtered main socket for every candidate, and we do find that the number of people who don't use that is steadily growing. So we had one or two about 3 years ago. I think the last e-exam I observed, about 10% of students felt that their laptop was more than adequate with its charge to last throughout the e-exam. Tanya's asked what's the maximum number of students sitting an exam per session. That's a difficult one to answer, Tanya. We've had about 200 doing one simultaneously, but that's all around the world. The maximum we've had in any one venue is about 150. I hope that's an adequate answer for your question. So look, I've gone through the logistics. I'll come to that in a minute, Kurt, of running an e-exam. What I want to do is to look just at the individual student, because I think understanding this process is the thing that they found most difficult, and I'd like to make sure I pass it on to you as well. So the way I describe this is that when you normally start a laptop, you press the power button and you go into the operating system, which is loaded up from the internal hard drive. However, if you want to do an e-exam, you have to work out what the one-time boot key is for your particular make and model. So in the bottom of this slide, I'm showing the e-exam USB has been plugged into the laptop. The user has pressed the power key in the normal way, and then he or she quickly presses down the one-time boot key. And that allows them to choose a different source for their operating system. Now, we actually train our students by releasing a practice e-exam to them at least a month before their exam to get them used to this technique. And we do say to them, because of course a lot of people have exam jitters, that it is possible, if you've got a BIOS in your system, to actually configure the BIOS to boot from a USB if one is inserted at startup. and that means you don't have to use the one-time boot key. You can just switch on with the USB inserted, and your machine will automatically go straight into the operating system on the USB. Okay, so I'm going back to Kurt's question, can this USB device connect to a wireless LAN, allowing the student to upload their paper? That's a question you should really take to Mathew Hillier, because he is putting forward a project and is applying for grant funding to take our system and combine it with the sort of version that you're talking about. My personal opinion is that if there's a communications channel available, it can be subverted and used for collusion purposes. That's the reason why I've not done it so far, but I do have a lot of people pressing me to provide that wireless link for particularly the backup of the answer scripts on a regular basis. Do the supervisors need to be more technologically savvy than in the past? Our suggestion is that they should not be. We do, however, have IT officers standing by which the supervisors can bring in should they feel that it's a problem which is a technological problem rather than a supervisor problem. Jim is taking up an argument with Kurt, I think, there, so I'm going to say that I'm avoiding wireless networks and I'm trying to make this system work as it is. Now, what I want to do is to have a look at the next slide. Okay, that's good. Okay, there's a 10-second video at that YouTube link. Mathew, if you're able to, could you place that in? Oh, you can click the link. Me click the link? I think Matthew's, perhaps everyone, click the link. You'll see that there's one fellow there, James, who kindly consented for this video to be made available, who is typing extremely fast, and you'll see that he's actually working in an exam room where people beside him have their own computers, but people in front of him are just handwriting. And it's quite interesting to listen to the comments that people have made when they come out of that exam room. Students have said it was an absolute blessing. They felt liberated and relieved of the pressure that handwriting puts upon them. And I like this comment, yes, you could just change things, which is, of course, the big difference between handwriting and word processing. So it does make a difference, and students who choose this option really appreciate it. And I do know that our physiotherapists near our campus do a very good business during exam period times. Because people are just not used to writing for 2 or 3 hours at a sitting. Okay, so let's step back from a particular exam and look now at the ways in which an institution might begin to go about moving into this particular mode of using the computer in exams. Mathew probably can remember his own examinations. So the first thing we talk about is the paper replacement strategy. That is where the paper, the exam questions are written in such a way that it can be delivered on paper and answered on paper. So that's a very simple way of making sure that students can actually have a choice, as we saw in the video and we saw in the slide. Thank you, Kurt. I will look at that a little bit later, a digital pen for exam. That sounds very, very interesting indeed. So I presume you could probably change your words if you're using that digital pen. Thank you. So paper replacement is our first recommended strategy for lecturers who have never done this before, or for institutions that are wanting to give it a go. But we do suggest that they might consider at some point, once they're comfortable and their students are comfortable with doing exams which are paper-based on a computer screen and using a keyboard instead of a pen, to then consider a post-paper strategy. So this is something that we've been doing for a little while in my area. So for example, what have I given in a post-paper exam, I've asked students to behave as teachers, because I'm training teachers, to train them to assess digital artifacts. And this particular digital artifact was a multimedia PowerPoint with audio and video and animations. And of course it would be very difficult for me to provide that on a paper exam, an exam paper. So that was the first thing. We were also able to include a PDF of the relevant skills checklist for them to use when they were doing that assessment. And I've even been approached by the people in the law faculty who would like to include the recommended e-book on the e-exam USB, which of course is entirely feasible. This one's a bit more interesting because I'm asking people to consider using computers in their own teaching. I want them to be able to demonstrate that they have the skills of critiquing software. And the software that I've taken this little clip from is a piece of Windows software. And those of you who are technical have noticed that I've identified Ubuntu as the operating system in which we're working. But there is a bit of an application called Wine, which stands for Windows is not essential. And we've made it default so that Windows software can run in the Ubuntu environment. And we were able to have students use this bit of software, it's a bit of simulation software, and then write a critique about where in the curriculum they might see it working. And that's a nice example of using the full operating system. And finally, there's just a shot there from a video which we included as well. And certainly the law faculty, I mentioned them again and again, I know, are very interested in the idea of asking students to, for instance, see a video of a policeman going into a crime scene and then asking them, you know, where was the chain of evidence contaminated by the actions of this person, and ask more questions about scenarios. Very often we will see examinations where a scenario is described and students might spend 4 or 5 minutes reading through a text description of a scenario. If we've got access to the video, that might make it a lot easier to have the scenario described. In terms of what students can do, we would like to go beyond typing their answers. I got permission from my students last year to take these images. I asked them to demonstrate their familiarity with a fairly standard piece of software called GIMP, and there's quite a nice lot of images which they produced in their examination, and I think most of you will appreciate that these are going beyond what you might normally find as a sketch done with a pencil in an examination. So we can certainly make it so that their responses are beyond text as well, although I have to say we haven't gone much beyond text. We've just gone to this particular piece of software. So I've given a description, and I've mentioned a few faculties which have adopted the e-exam system at the University of Tasmania. It has been approved by our Senate, and the University of Edinburgh had to get Senate approval for their use of computers in examinations using Exam 4. We did find that it was interesting to talk to our pre-tertiary, that is, the sector of education where students are about age 17 or 18 and are preparing to become candidates to join the university. And the responsible authority here in Tasmania is the Tasmanian Qualifications Authority, and they run examinations in the whole of Tasmania in a large number of subjects, about 50 or 60 subjects, and I was very interested to hear from them why they weren't doing some innovation in this area themselves. And it was quite interesting hearing their response, in that we have quite a few schools, particularly those that are high fee paying, pardon me, where many of the students, in fact all the students, bring a laptop to school. And you would have thought there would have been a lot of pressure from those schools to allow their students to use computers in assessment. talking with the Chief Operating Officer, he said, no, those schools weren't pushing for exams in the pre-tertiary sector because they wanted to ensure that they had a very high reputation. And part of that high reputation was the success those students got when they got to university. And because the university at that time was locked into pen on paper assessment, they wanted to make sure that they got very good at that modality. Yes, Jeff, I'll get to the Pinot when I get home. I want to drive home safely. Thank you. So it was interesting that the pre-tertiary sector would not shift until we had shifted at the university level. Because we'd started to do that, they actually did take on the idea of doing some e-exams themselves. And in 2011, all the candidates for one particular course did an e-exam, and that was a paper replacement exam. The last year, 2012, at the end of 2012, all the candidates for that same subject did a post-paper exam, and out of interest, the post-paper element was the fact that they had to critique a website, and the website was provided on the USB stick for them. So that's a nice example of institutional adoption. They've downloaded the software from our website. They've sought just one meeting with myself to discuss the implications, and they've run the whole show themselves since then. So I'm really pleased with that. However, talking to the chairman of the authority, he points out that they are often challenged, especially by parents whose children have not done as well in this competitive race to get into university as they would have liked. And therefore, they do have a very strong ethos about equity. And for them, this definition of equity is every candidate has exactly the same opportunity and the same assessment environment. And therefore, for the TQA, the Tasmanian Qualifications Authority, when they went into e-exams, they had to ensure that every candidate was using the computer. There was no opportunity, even though the first step was paper replacement, there was no opportunity for people to choose to use paper. It was there as a fallback if the technology failed, but it was a definition of equity very different to our own, whereas in the university we consider it to be equitable if every student has a free choice to use the writing implement they feel suits them best. So I'm going to wind up in about 5 minutes, so it would be nice if people were starting to think of questions. In 2007 then, we started off with 120 candidates in a paper replacement mode using institutional equipment, as I've said, in laboratories. The topic was educational computing, and it was on the campus here in Launceston. Since then, we've now gone, I think we're getting close to the 1,500 candidates. We've gone to full multimedia and questions requiring the operation of software. We've moved quite nicely to personally owned computers. We're now finding when we point out to people they don't actually have to own a laptop, they just have to have one for practice and for the 2 hours of exam. That makes it quite feasible. Of course, we do arrange in our large venues to have a few spares just in case, and we have had a student who's run an e-exam on a computer which had a buggered, I'll use the technical term, hard drive, because of course we don't need the hard drive to be operational for this. So that has now switched over, and we're able to now say to students, you need to supply the computer. Quite a range of different places now, so law, mathematics, pedagogy, the TQA, the Information Technology and Systems one. Debbie Weaver's asked a question, is there a way for students to respond via an automated system, like an MCQ test for automated marking? This still seems to be very manual processing. Debbie, you're right, and bringing in that multiple choice questions bit is part of the topic which Mathew Hillier is addressing in the grant application I referred to earlier. Coming to that, Vicky, in a minute, but let me just finish off this last little bit. So this was the comment about the TQA, and I will note that they have also used a digital reticulation system for their marking, which I think is very, very important to note. So what I'd like to do is to show you the kind of question I think we should be able to prepare. I would expect to be able to deliver a scenario with a hyperlink to a video. I would also be able to include a hyperlink to a particular piece of software, software that is used by professionals in the area, and we would expect the responses to come back with something more than just typed words. It could actually be a file to go with that software, showing their ingenuity and their mastery of professional skills using professional tools. So my final slide is the short form of the website. You're very welcome to go there and download the current version, which is working with Ubuntu 12.04 LTS, which I believe that goes back to Vicky's question. So it's 12.04. We try to update every second release of Ubuntu. So the next one we'll probably go for will be 14.04. We just don't have, unfortunately, the funding to allow us to keep up to date every single minute of the day. So thank you, Vicky, for that question. And I'm now moving to answering questions. Perhaps I'll just finish the ones that are on the chat line, Geoff, and then ask you to then take over the chair again. Kurt, are you supporting all OSs on the student's own devices? The point I'm trying to make, Kurt, is that we do not allow the student to use their own operating system on their internal hard drive. They boot from the USB, and therefore they only get our version of Ubuntu with the suite of software we provided on the USB. Yeah, and I think Mathew has made the point that the bootable USB works on most Intel-based machines. The big challenge I'm getting at the moment is for dealing with tablets, and I have to confess, that's too hard. Over to you, Geoff or Mathew.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. I think you can see from the types of questions that people have been putting in the chat that this is obviously a very interesting topic, and a topic that people certainly want to hear a little bit more about in terms of the details. What Mathew's put up on the whiteboard now is the link to our feedback survey. So while we're asking the questions and while you're thinking about your comments, if people wouldn't mind also clicking on that link and filling out the feedback survey. That's both for Andrew so that he can get some feedback, but also for us in terms of running the webinar series. So please, we can hand over the mic to anyone if you want to put your hand up, or you can continue to put in questions. So it looks like Greg's gone in straight away. I'll hand the mic over to you, Greg. Okay, Greg, you need to press the talk button if you would like to ask a question. And perhaps, Greg, if we're not hearing anything if you think you're pressing the button. So, Greg, maybe if you're having trouble with the microphone, if you want to type in your question perhaps in the chat area, and if there's anyone else that would like to try taking the mic, otherwise... Greg, we certainly hear Greg, we can hear you typing, and you've still got your mic on as well.
Okay, so I've got my mic on too loud. Okay, I'll turn it down.
I can hear that. I can hear that.
How's that?
Good. If you don't mind, whilst Greg's getting his microphone sorted, I'm just going to talk about Tanya's question, who asked, has the per exam cost increased? And that's a very good question to ask. What I point out is that the cost of buying a USB stick is approximately 10 times the cost of printing an exam paper. In other words, if you can use that USB stick 10 times, you're then ahead. Of course, I've discounted the capital cost of getting the USB duplicators, but of course then you would have to have the cost of printers as well. So it is possible to get ahead, because one would expect that a USB would be able to be used many, many more times than 10, but the initial cost, of course, is an upfront cost. So thank you very much, Tanya. Okay, I've got Greg's question now. If you wanted the students to access software such as Maple or Mathematics or even Wolfram Alpha, then can we do it using links? When you say links, Greg, yes. What I've said is that some Windows software can run within the Ubuntu environment. I've never tried it with something as complex as Maple. You're challenging me to have a go, and I think that's a very good thing for me to hear from you, because I've talked about the rich environment. There are, in fact, open source Linux-based tools which are similar, like Sage, S-A-G-E, and I would be very happy that that equivalent bit of software would run. We are now, of course, getting to the point where you've got to argue for student familiarity with the assessment environment against having these powerful packages as part of the assessment process. So there are pressures in both directions. I'm just looking at Vicky's question just ahead. How familiar with Linux do students need to be? Vicky, the usual point is that when they first fire up the USB stick, they think they're in Windows because we make it look so similar. So we do, however, want them to be thoroughly familiar with it, and that's why I did mention before we give them a practice USB stick at least a month before, and they've got that to become familiar with it, and they've got the set of candidate instructions. One thing I didn't mention in my talk is that we have been working within the university to try to make the thing foolproof. We now have a version which is not released open source, which has a greeter. This means that in addition to the picture that people see when they fire up their machine and get the desktop, they get a little bar which allows them to type in their candidate number, and our greeter automatically picks up the question paper, pins their ID number to it, saves it into the correct location, and basically once they've typed in their ID number, they are then facing the exam paper and are able to write answers. So that custom build, if you like, has removed very much of the need for any knowledge of the operating system to be learned at all. So that's been really nice. Okay, I'm looking at Marion and Mathew. Thank you for answering that. So yes, the lecturer's cat is beautiful. And Tim, you've mentioned Maxima. Yeah, Sage goes, I think Sage includes Maxima. So Sage goes a little bit further than that. Have I used any e-exams at exam centres in Asia for distance students? Ruth, you've asked that. I've mentioned that we've used it in overseas locations. Whether or not they've been in Asia, I'm not entirely sure. I do know that when we do run international courses, the students can be anywhere in the world. And the normal process is, just as with a written exam paper, the USB is posted to a trusted supervisor. The exam is conducted under their supervision and signed off with a statutory declaration or the equivalent, and returned by post. hence, I can understand, and that's why I've agreed to collaborate with Mathew Hillier in the idea of bringing in some sort of trusted single IP addressed networking function, just to speed up the return of the answer scripts as much as anything. Okay, Tim, how many times have you hit technical problems with a student's laptop? Do you have a fallback, like reverting to paper? Tim, that's a really important point, and that is basically the major thing from the candidate's point of view. Look, we set the system up to use the auto-saving opportunities within OpenOffice and LibreOffice, so that there's an auto-save every 2 to 4 minutes. For students who inquire in that practice period, the month before the actual exam, we're more than happy to show them how to play with that auto-save setting, but we do point out to them that there's a point of diminishing returns. If you auto-save every 30 seconds, you're not going to get much work done because your computer's going to be busy auto-saving. How many times have we had technical problems? If we have a technical problem, if a machine goes into, let's call it, technical meltdown, power it off, power it straight up again, the LibreOffice recovers the document, and at the most they may have lost a couple of minutes writing time. Our gauge to say whether that's okay or not is how long does it take to take a toilet break. If we can recover their system in about the time it takes to do a toilet break, we think that's fair dues. Considering that they've had a month to play with the system and ensure themselves that their computer works with it. We do, as I said, have spare machines, and yes, very, very occasionally, I would say about 1% of occasions, somebody might fall back to paper. So that's hopefully answered Tim's question. And I'm now looking at Marion's question: what are the main advantages of your USB-based system over lockdown URL-based? Marion, I think I tried to cover that earlier. If you're working within a lockdown URL environment, you're probably working within a web browser. And that means there are an awful lot of restrictions in terms of what you can do. Now, some people are very clever with Flash and can do Flash programming. And if you're prepared to do something, well, as a major effort to make an application run within a web browser, that's fine. But the point I'm trying to make is that I felt that that restriction will actually restrict what we can do with computers in assessment, and perhaps even restrict the way in which the use of computers can transform our teaching practice. So that's why I've gone for the USB rather than a URL. Sorry, Tim, how many times has this happened in one of your exams? I'm saying 1% is about as much as we've ever had failure in an exam situation. Darren asks, has there been a situation where a technical problem, could not be resolved and what action was taken? That was the sort of example as the yes, that's the sort of example of what action we took. We reverted back to paper. And Tim's pointing 1% is a lot. Yeah, we have been challenged particularly by the TQA to ensure that our system is as reliable as their current paper systems. And that's more like 1 in 1,000. And I won't claim that we're quite there yet, but we do have the capacity to fall back to paper if we want to. Okay, Megan, you wanted me to repeat how we ensure the computer's secure. We are going to have to take that question on notice. As I was saying earlier, we removed the IP stack, so the Internet Protocol was not operational in our earlier versions. Our programmer has now done, he tells me, some very clever things since then to make sure that communication is not possible using any of the technologies in most laptops. Thank you, Tim, for your endorsement. I would like to get to 1 in 1,000, but you know, the TQA are obviously being hard-nosed, and quite rightly so, because the opportunity for their candidates to go into university depends upon them getting their assessment regime correct. Okay. And yeah, I'm endorsing Geoff's point that we would like to set assessment tasks that are more sophisticated than on just pen and paper. We get an awful lot of mixture of quality of student laptops. I'll tell you one small thing about this. I've talked about some of the very poor laptops that we've had. I have had students come out of an exam and say, wow, I wish my laptop ran that fast all the time. I think they get excited because they've effectively had a solid-state hard drive for the duration of the exam, and so therefore their machine has gone outstandingly fast, not being slowed up by a very slow mechanical drive. Okay, unless there are any more questions, I think we may have come to the end. Geoff or Mathew?
Yes, certainly it looks like the questions are slowing down. So are there any last questions from anyone? Yeah, Mathew and Andrew, are you going to keep that for a future webinar?
Tim, if you want to email me, I can explain about what it is. Essentially, I stuck in an Australian Teaching and Learning Council grant, the OLT, which is our new federal body in Australia that hands out money for teaching and learning projects. But it's not confirmed yet. So essentially what we're trying to do is put in more computer mark question types and network, reticulation of answers to try and cut down on the manual processing of exams and things like that. But, I had a summer school student just a couple of months ago who we developed a proof of concept with restricted network access, and we were able to lock it down so that the student could only go to our institution's Blackboard server. So in theory it's possible, but we'll see when and if I get the grant money as to whether it will go forward. I will do a webinar on it once we've developed a solution, so it's probably going to be a good 12 to 18 months before that's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But very happy to talk to people about possibilities for collaboration, exchanging ideas, etc.
Okay, I might do the formal thank you to Andrew. So Andrew, thank you very much for your time tonight. I can see from the number of questions that we had that this has generated a significant amount of interest. And I think one of the things, Andrew, that's always impressed me is the amount of thought that you put into the practicalities of running large-scale computer-based exams. And I think it's really nice to see someone who's actually thought that through so that we can do these things on scale and also keep the confidence of the educational authorities and all of our stakeholders in this system. Because essentially when we start doing assessment online, I think one of the things we absolutely need to be aware of is what is the perception of our stakeholders in the veracity of this process that we're putting forward for this. So thanks, Andrew, for your talk tonight. Once again, as I indicated to people, I had heard you speak before, and I'm always impressed by, first of all, the amount of work that's been done on this, but the fact that it actually works on scale. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, everyone. Mathew, we could probably stop the recording now.